Well, as we are continuing our study in the book of Ruth, and if you want to turn there, we come to chapter 4. Last week we left with a plot twist in chapter 3. Naomi had encouraged her daughter-in-law Ruth to go out into the threshing floor to see where Boaz lies and to go lie next to him after he's fallen asleep and remove the covering of his feet. And when he wakes up, to hear what he says, listen to what he says. When he does wake up and notices that there's a woman laying at his feet, what does she say? She tells him, "Spread your wings over me," basically saying, you need to marry me. We had mentioned it's a proposal, but also a legality, a legal request by Ruth of Boaz. And Boaz is encouraged. He's thrilled that she would do such a thing. He's excited. He wants to marry her. And then the plot twist comes. There's one more redeemer above me. There's one more guy who has the rank above me. We have to ask him first. And then you're wondering, what's going to happen? Is she going to get to marry Boaz? Or will she fall into the hands of someone else? Now here's the positive side of that plot twist. We know that Ruth and Naomi will be taken care of. Either the one guy who's ahead of Boaz is going to be their redeemer, or Boaz is going to be their redeemer. Someone will redeem them so that no longer will they be widowed and live in poverty and want. They will be taken care of. That's the positive side of the story. We also know that this matter will be taken care of quickly. This isn't going to linger on in the court systems. Because we know, look at verse 18 of chapter 3, if you've turned there already. She replied, meaning Naomi, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man," meaning Boaz, "will not rest, but will settle the matter today." So as Ruth comes back from the threshing floor that morning, she says, don't worry about it, because Boaz this morning is going to take care of it. He is going to resolve this issue immediately. And so we come to chapter 4 in the book of Ruth, and we see how this story ends. We begin to first see that Boaz goes from the threshing floor that morning to the gates. Look at verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Now for us in our culture, in our time, you might wonder, well, why the gates? Why does he go to the city gate? Why doesn't he go find this guy? He knows who he is. And go knock on his door and say, hey, we got to resolve this issue. No, he sits at the gate. Why? Because this is where the courts are. This is where disputes are decided. This is where issues of legal matters are put into place. This is where judges are, judges of court systems, if you would, if we could put it in our kind of vernacular. He is there entering into the gates because that's where the courts are. And he sits there and he waits for this other redeemer to come by. There's only one way in and out of the city. And he gets there early enough to know that no one else has gone out. And so he waits for the other redeemer. We see that in the rest of verse 1. And behold, the redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. Now it's interesting, he says to him, friend. He calls him friend. And what's interesting about that particular word, it's actually ambiguous. If we wanted to put it more accurately, it was as if he was said, "Now, Mr. So-and-so, why don't you come and sit down here?" And what it implies to us in this story is that the writer of this story does not want to actually name this person, because it was actually, if he doesn't take Ruth as his redeemer, if he doesn't redeem Naomi's land and redeem Ruth, it's actually an act of shame. And so the author protects him. It's like saying that the names of the innocent have been changed, right, in the story. That's what the author is doing here. Come aside, friend. Mr. So-and-so, come over here. I don't want to name you. I don't want to shame you, but have a seat here. And so as this man, this other redeemer, sits down, Boaz then gathers the others around him in verse 2, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And so they sat down. And so now the situation has been set. He has the defendant, the defender, the redeemer there, and now he's got 10 witnesses. Now the law only required 2 or 3 witnesses, but maybe here, some speculate that maybe here in Bethlehem, they said that we're going to have a full 10 witnesses to the events that transpire that would extend the life. Remember, most of this stuff is not written down. People have to remember the events. And so if you have 10 over 3 witnesses, you have a better chance that the events of this moment last longer in the minds and the hearts of the people. And so he gathers these 10 witnesses around them with this one Redeemer, and he sets the situation before them. He has his audience, and maybe he started and say, "Now I'm sure you're wondering why I've gathered you here together. Why did you pull me aside, Boaz? I got my fields. We're threshing grain out there too, Boaz." And the elder's like, "Hey, what's going on here?" So what does he do? Verse 3. And then he says to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to her relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides me to redeem it, and I come after you." So he kind of lays out the situation. Look, Naomi has a field owned by, remember her husband Elimelech, he passed away. Her sons passed away. They have no inheritor. Who's going to inherit this land? And it comes down to this Redeemer and Boaz. He's second in line. This one Redeemer is first. Boaz is second. This first Redeemer, he has the right of refusal. It was a legal obligation for Boaz to point this out, to bring this to his attention. Someone has to redeem this land so that it can remain in our own clan and in our own people. And so he's laid out this situation to this Redeemer. He's explained to him that this is widows. Naomi is a widower, has left this land. And you can, if you are reading through the lines, you might think of this guy pondering, measuring in his thought, what's the ROI on this? What's the return of investment? If I buy this land, what am I getting out of it? Am I getting a sufficient return? If I buy this land, it's going to cost me something, and then I have to take care of a widow, right? That's the obligation here. In purchasing the land, you're not only just purchasing the land, you're saying, I will care for Naomi as a widow, and then when she dies, and then the land reverts into my family. It becomes my land because there's no one to inherit it on her side, Elimelech's side. And so now it becomes part of a parcel of my land. And so we might be thinking, okay, I think that's a good trade. I'll buy the land, I'll take care of Naomi, and then when she passes, it becomes part of my inheritance that I can pass on to my children. And he quickly responds, without probably thinking that much, is, I'll do it. I will redeem it. And this is where Boaz steps back in and he says, whoa. Hey, I get it. I know you want to redeem it, but I just want to point out, I want to be fair. I want to be transparent here. I want you to see, look at the contract. There's some small print down here. Did you read the small print? Because I just want to make sure we're on the same page here. Well, let me just tell you what that small print is. This is verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also require Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Now what Boaz is doing is he's changing the whole parameter of what the land means. If it was just Naomi, and it was just there are no inheritors after her, and he just purchases the land and has to wait for her to pass, and it becomes his, that made sense to him. That was a good return on investment. That was a good ROI. But now you've added something different. Now you've added more information. Now you've revealed the fine print. You have to marry Ruth, and then you have to produce a son, and that first son will inherit the land. You have to perpetuate the lineage of Elimelech and Mahalan, her husband, and that firstborn son from Ruth will become the inheritor of that land. Now this gentleman has to weigh this out. Because if he has to do that and produce a son, and then the son gets that land, I've invested all this money, I had to buy the land, and then it's not going to go to my family, it's going to go to Elimelech and Mahalan's family. It's going to perpetuate that lineage. And so I've only temporarily owned it. I get to service it with whatever grain and stuff I want to, whatever I need to grow, but eventually it gets passed on not to my children, but to someone else's children. Now everything's changed. Now the ROI doesn't make sense. Now I struggle. Now he's struggling with the idea of investing. On top of that, I think, this is just my speculation, but when Boaz says Ruth the Moabite, I think he says Ruth the Moabite, right? He overemphasizes the Moabite. Because remember, as we began this story, Moabites are not really appreciated amongst the Israelites. They are actually enemies of Israel. They are foreigners that they despise. They have a history of causing problems with Israel. And so that tension that's there, even though she has proved herself to be a wonderful woman, a godly woman, a woman of great faith and a great commitment and love for Naomi, I believe that Boaz just pushed that emphasis a little harder, the Moabite, to discourage this Redeemer. And so what does he do? And that's exactly what he does. In verse 6, he says, I can't redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, I looked through several different commentaries and study Bibles, and they all pretty much said the same thing. No one really understands what he means by this will impair my own inheritance. It's really at a loss. What we can surmise from this is that he saw that it was not an effective investment for himself. Whatever that means. And here again is because he's refused what is an actual obligation for him legally to take on, he has refused that his name has been hidden from us to prevent shame to him and his family. Because the story is greater than that. And the author of the book of Ruth, does not want to take away from the truth of the story and the beauty of the story and the glory of the story by putting shame on someone else. And so they hide his name. So Boaz decides to follow through. He's now been given, in front of witnesses, he's been given the right of refusal has come to the first Redeemer, and he has refused. And so he passes that on to Boaz as the second in line. And then Boaz completes the transaction. We see this beginning in verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon, also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. And so he's completed the transaction. The other redeemer removes his shoe. It sounds weird to us, but this is a custom of their day. And so they would transact this way, and Boaz takes on the responsibility of not only purchasing the property, but taking Ruth as his wife to perpetuate the line of Mahlon, Elimelech and Mahlon, and then following. Now we will, and maybe I'll deal with it now in this moment, because later in the chapter, the son that is born is called the son of Boaz. And so here is the reality. Genetically, genealogically, he is the son of Boaz. When it comes to the inheritance, that son is the son of Mahlon. And so he gets the inheritance that Mahlon would have received, or all of the land, because there's only two brothers and they're both dead. So it passes on to the next son in line, which would be the son that comes from their union. And it's merely a son of inheritance, but genealogically, he's the son of Boaz. And we'll see that as we close out this chapter. And so Boaz has made clear in front of the witnesses, the 10 elders who are there to witness this transaction, I have completed this, I have done it, I've committed to it, and now it is a legal transaction, and you are my witnesses of this. Immediately there is a response, a jubilant response, not only from the elders, but from the crowds that gathered there. And apparently, as this is going on, this discussion, there are other people who are passing through the gates who see this Redeemer and see Boaz and see that they have had the 10 elders set aside, and that they gathered as an audience to see what's going on. They were a little nosy. But you're in the middle of the gate. Everybody's coming in and out. And it's not like you can hide these things. And so they gathered around, and we know it's just more than them, because look at verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, right? So they had gathered a crowd there amongst them who had seen and heard this transaction transpiring, and that Boaz had committed himself to take on the help of purchasing the land and taking Ruth as his wife. And so they all say, not only the 10 witnesses, but all the crowd that is there, we are witnesses. They're excited. And so they go on to say, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthy in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Here the crowd proclaims a blessing upon Boaz and Ruth because he is willing to do this. And they cry out with the names of Rachel and Leah. Here are the matriarchs of the tribes of Israel. Here are the women who stand at the fountainhead of these tribes. And they would have been remembered in many ways in this little town of Bethlehem. Rachel would have been remembered because this is where she has been buried. When she gave birth to her final son, and she dies in childbirth, this is where Jacob buries her. And so she's remembered here. But more importantly, Bethlehem was within the tribe of Judah, who is a son of Leah. And so they would have remembered both these wonderful mothers and how they have been at the fountainhead of the beginning of their nation. What is strange there is the mention of Tamar. Now, if you know anything about Tamar's position in the Scripture in Genesis 38, by the way, if you're with us on Thursday, we're not far from there. We're getting close to that chapter. It's a kind of sordid tale. In fact, I remember many years ago when I was teaching in a Sunday school class here at this church, long time ago, and we're doing the same thing we're doing Thursday night. We're just going verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and we're plodding along, and we get to this chapter 38 of Genesis, and I'm reading, and it's like, man, I don't want to spend more than a week, half a Sunday. I just want to kind of zip through it and get over it and get over to chapter 30. Get back to Joseph. It's like this parenthetical chapter within the life of Joseph. And I was like, I just want to move on. 3 weeks later, we finally finished that chapter. And I was like, I don't know why we did that, but that's what happened. But in that chapter, Tamar is mentioned, and she was a foreigner like Ruth. And she was in a very similar situation as Ruth, because she had married one of the sons of Judah, the older son of Judah, and God had a problem with this son, and so he kills him. And so by way of rights of the Levirate marriage, that the next son in line who is not married had to marry Tamar to perpetuate the lineage of his brother, and he chose not to. He marries her, but chooses not to have children with her. And so God kills him. Now there's a third boy, and he's too young to marry at the time. And so she is told, well, you just go be a widower in your father's house until such a time that this younger son grows old enough and he'll marry you, and then he can perpetuate the line of the original brother, the first brother. Well, Judah is concerned, because he does not want to see this son die also. So Tamar realizes when the son becomes of age that she is being slighted here. And so she takes off her widow's garments and dresses herself up as a prostitute and goes and waits to the side and finds Judah, who is her father-in-law. He doesn't recognize her. Purchases her services, and she gets pregnant. And she has twins, and one of them is the son Perez. Now, I won't give you all the other details about how that all worked out and how they discovered this and all the things like that, but the point here is, this is the son that's mentioned here, that may you be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, her father-in-law. And what's interesting about Perez is it appears that even though he is a son of Judah, he is not the primary son. The primary son now is the third son, the last son that's left. But we kind of lose him in the story. Perez, for whatever reason, rises up and becomes popular and dominant and predominant in not only the city of Bethlehem, but in the clans of Judah. He becomes predominant. And so they say, may you be like the house of Perez, who has grown, even though he's a son of some shameful activity, he has been grown to such prominence that they encourage the son that you have with Ruth, may he be like Perez. And so Ruth and Tamar are actually very similar in nature, in their circumstances, although the way that their children came about, Ruth is a more pure situation. We see in verse 13 the marriage ceremony summarized and the blessings of their marriage. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Here's some... Think through the story we've gone through. When she married Mahalan and they were in Moab, they had been there for 10 years without child. And yet the moment she marries Boaz, she's pregnant. Now, modern day technology would say, well, maybe Mahalan had some issues and they couldn't have children and blah, 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 blah. Biblically, all of that's irrelevant. Because we know, if you've been with us through Genesis, you know over and over and over again, it reminds us that God opens the womb and closes the womb. God decides when a child is going to be conceived. He is the author and giver of life, and He decides when a child is not going to be conceived. It is God who is sovereign over the womb. And here in Ruth's life, it was God who was sovereign over her womb to prevent her from being pregnant with Mahalan, because if she got pregnant, then this whole story is lost. It's gone. It never happens. But now she marries Boaz, and they do have a son. A son is born into their house. He will inherit Mahalan's inheritance, but he will be a child of Boaz as well. Notice the response to this in the community, particularly with the women in verse 14. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may His name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave his name, and saying, "A son has been born to Naomi," they named him Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Throughout this story, we have seen the providential hand of God. We've seen it in Ruth's life, but more so in Naomi's life. The story is called Ruth, but it could easily be called Naomi, because she is the one at the beginning who returns to Israel, one who is bitter. But we come to the end of the story, and she is the one who is now blessed. At the beginning of the story, she's the one who has been empty. But at the end of the story, she's the one who comes with fullness in her life. At the beginning of the story, she has been left in poverty. At the end of the story, she has plenty. And this really is what the Christian life is. That we are ones who are dead in our trespasses and sins, but made alive by God. We are ones who are children of the devil, and because of Jesus Christ, we're now children of God. We have been redeemed from our old way of life, of hatred towards God, now brought into the light and now love God. This is what the Christian life is really all about. There are some key things, markers in here in this particular passage I just read. The women say that she has not left without a redeemer. Now, they're talking about the son, the Obed. Not Boaz as the redeemer, but Obed as her redeemer. Because now the inheritance comes to him. We have not been left without a redeemer either. And his name is Jesus Christ. He has redeemed his children, God's children, for God's sake, the Father's sake. They say of this redeemer of Obed that his name may be renowned in all of Israel. Well, Christ's name was renowned in all of Israel. It says that he would be a restorer of life and a nourisher of old age. And that's exactly what Christ has done. He's given us life, and he nourishes us through his grace every day. Ruth is declared here as being more valuable, more than 7 sons. Now, for us, we don't understand that, right? But to have a son in the ancient Near Eastern culture was critical to a household. It was critical to a woman, to a family. And the more sons you had, the better off you were. And these people are saying, Ruth has become better, more than 7 sons. And so they elevate Ruth in this level of social awareness that she is better because of what she has done for Naomi in providing this child. What is kind of strange here to us, maybe, but part of their culture is that it's not Ruth who names the child. It's not Naomi who names the child. It's the woman of the community who named the child. And maybe this is particular to Bethlehem, and no one is quite sure of that, but we know that they called this young boy, this newborn boy, Obed, which means servant. Again, we see here another reference that points us to Jesus Christ, because Jesus says in Mark 10:45, I have come not to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. Strangely, this particular story doesn't end there. The last verses are a genealogy. Beginning at verse 18, now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Why is this important? Why is it significant? Why do we have this particular genealogy here? What's interesting is, until you get to the book of Chronicles, which is written after the exile, or sometime during the exile in Babylon, so towards the end of these long reigns of kings, you never hear of a genealogy from Perez to David. This is the only place in all of Scripture up until that point of the Chronicles, which was written much later, that we see in this connection. This is the connection that we have of the genealogical line to the Savior. This is the connection to David, who is going to be the father of the greater Son, who is Jesus Christ. He is going to receive the Davidic covenant with God, and saying, God says to him, your son will sit on your throne forever and ever. And who is that son? It's not Solomon, and it's not any of the sons that follow after him. It's Jesus Christ who will sit on that throne forever. And so here we have this connection to the work of God. The history of redemption is being brought forth in this genealogy to tell us that it is from the tribe of Judah, which we know about and hear about in Genesis chapter 49, where Jacob gives these prophetic words to each of his sons, and he says to Judah, the scepter will never depart from your lineage. Speaking of the king who is coming. And who is that king? As we said before, it is the son of David, the offspring of David, the King Jesus who will come. And so here is the lineage connection from Judah to Perez and following all the way to David, to speak of the messianic line. Here we're reminded that the decrees of God, which were established from all eternity, that God determined what will happen, and He's cared for every little detail along the way to make sure what He has determined will happen. Or as the Westminster Confession of Faith says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of His own will, freely and unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass. Before creation, God had planned this marriage between Boaz and Ruth. And through time, He worked His plan until He gets to this moment. He brings them together. It seems by happenstance that they're brought together, but it's all part of God's decree, all part of God's plan, so that He might bring about the Son of David, particularly Jesus Christ. There's no randomness to this, not from God's perspective. He has decreed these things, and He will bring them to pass. Just as He decreed from all of creation, before creation, that Christ would come into the world. And not just come into the world, but He would be conceived into the womb of the Virgin Mary. That He would be born a child, a baby. born in poverty, born under the law, Paul says, so that he might redeem us from the law, from the sin and death. This story is meant to push us and point us to Jesus Christ, to show that God is working in history, in time, to redeem a people for himself. The story of Ruth has brought us into the midst of this Advent season, and we are here this season recognizing the coming of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, born in human flesh, born in the city of David, born in Bethlehem. And what we will see in the weeks to come as we walk through the rest of Advent is that this child is our prophet, our priest, and our king. And that is how we'll finish out the rest of our Sundays for Advent. Let's pray.